to blow up a bus. The other two, a Russian and a Chechen, were arrested on a bus heading to the border with France. Right, let's take you live now to a press conference in Moscow where a Syrian delegation is visiting the Russian capital. Let's just look into these pictures and hear what they're... In fact, we haven't got any sound, but this is a press conference of that Syrian delegation in Moscow. We know, I think, the Syrian Foreign Minister and a trade delegation is in the capital. Michael Stevens is here to talk us through what's going on. Michael, what are you making of this Syrian delegation to Moscow? I mean, Russia is an important ally. What's the visit all about, and what message are they trying to send?
Well, at the moment, I think that the Syrians are trying to outreach to some of their diplomatic partners. At the moment, they are faced with an increasingly hostile international arena and a Security Council now which has been emasculated because of, obviously, the developments of Kofi Annan's resignation last night. So I think that there's a very important discussion that needs to go on between the Syrians and the Russians as to how their diplomatic and friendship relationships go on from this point. I think at the moment, you know, there's an unknown zone. They don't know how things will move forward. They don't know what assistance the Russians can provide them now that the sort of international diplomatic framework which, you know, the Syrian regime was protected in has gone. So I think they need to clear up what steps forward they need to take together, whether the conflict will escalate and what the Russian help will be for the Syrian regime during that sort of escalation.
In terms of the wider picture, Michael, what is the relationship between the two countries, given the events that we're seeing on the ground in Syria? I mean, Russia, of course, seems to be standing firm at the UN, and the regime itself on the ground back in Damascus isn't backing down.
No, not at all. And the Russians have stood firm by their ally. I mean, the history between the two countries is quite deep, and it's very sort of engaged on many levels in business, defense. All sorts of arms sales have been taking place over the last 3 or 4 decades. And I think, you know, that the Russians have always viewed the Syrians as a stalwart ally, as a friend in the Middle East that they could rely upon, also sort of for the financial benefit of weapons sales. Obviously, you know, there's much talk about the base in Tartus, which is the Russian foothold in the region, in fact, the last strategic foothold in the region. So the relationship is close, and I think that the Russians, you know, their friendship has been a strange one recently because they've stood by the Assad regime even when it's not been beneficial for them to do so. So I think right now there's, you know, a bit of a negotiation process here as to what supporting Assad means for Russia and whether it's beneficial for them.
And at the same time, Russian media is reporting that Moscow is sending ships and a couple of hundred troops to its naval base in Syria. What can we, Michael, read into this? I mean, is Moscow flexing its military muscle to back up its diplomatic position?
I don't think that Russian military movements into Tartus are indicating that the Russians will support Assad militarily. I've heard from some sources that actually the Russians have been tasked with looking after some of the chemical weapons stocks and issues that might happen there. And in fact, actually, since that, you know, a lot of these chemical weapons were developed with Russian help, it would make sense if they are the ones that take the responsibility for dealing with them. So in that sense, there may be that lane of action. But also, of course, the Russians have to look after their own interests, which is the protection of the base. They can't be assured now that the western coastline of Syria will remain intact, so they have to look after their interests as well. They can't rely on Assad now to defend sort of their strategic interest in the region. They must take it themselves. I think the increase of military troops doesn't necessarily mean an increase in diplomatic support. I think we need to sort of see the difference between the two. But I do think that, of course, you know, if Russia thought that the game was up, yes, of course, you would see less troops going in. So I think this is an indication that they are showing some support, but it's not necessarily overt diplomatic support.
Yeah, let's just remind our viewers what they're seeing on their TV screens. This is the press conference of the Syrian delegation who are visiting Damascus. We understand it's a diplomatic and a trade team who are visiting the Russian capital. Against the backdrop of this, Michael Stevens, we're expecting this vote at the UN General Assembly. It is an extraordinary one, condemning its own Security Council for failing to come to some kind of consensus to end the violence. This underlines the deep divisions within the international community, doesn't it?
Well, I think it underlines the deep divisions in the Security Council. I'm not sure if it underlines the deep divisions in the General Assembly. I think that the General Assembly vote will be quite unanimous, actually, and I think that you'll find that this resolution will probably pass. The problem with the General Assembly resolution is, of course, it doesn't actually change anything on the ground in Syria. So it's not going to, you know, affect the conflict in any way. It will criticize the UN Security Council, but the basic structure is still the same. You still have the Russians and the Chinese on one side and the West on the other. And it doesn't really matter what a number of little states do to sponsor a resolution in the General Assembly. It is unprecedented, that's for sure, but it doesn't actually change the problem. And the UN Security Council, regardless of this vote, will still be in the same deadlock that it always was in.
All right, Michael, let's just listen in now to the press conference and hear what they're saying there in the Russian capital.
It's not a moment, it's a strategical view and a long-term one. The relationship of between Russia and Syria is long and historically contributed to the building of Syria, and we believe that to renew this relationship and to jump to use it as springboard to a new relationship will contribute in the short term as well as the long term to deal with the long issues in front of the Syrian people. Some people might put a question if the crisis that's so deep, and you're talking about the medium term and long term relationship. We say the Syrian crisis will be solved. Will be solved first day after the crisis is dealt with. Syria, the new Syria, that will put the new Syria on the map. This is first. Secondly, there are many issues, economical issues, urgent ones, created by this crisis. The country is suffering from a blockade of economic and as well as sanctions. The Western Europe and the United States are leading these sanctions against against the regime. That's not true. The sanctions, the economical sanctions, is hitting every single citizenship and affecting every citizen in Syria. They say that they are firing at the regime, but in fact they are hurting the Syrian people. And we believe that today, and with the new international balance, that there is a new vision that the Syrian people can find alternatives, urgent economical solutions to keep the balance, to keep the people. And that means that the West and the United States are not the only one who draw the politics. The Syrian people have many alternatives. That's why the slogans that the government espoused to go east, the new government, the current government, has many oppositions in it. That the peaceful opposition. And this government, we believe, is the first step towards to the new formation of the reconciliation government. And the important slogan of this is for the national conciliation to take place. The national conciliation is central, and the national conciliation cannot be done without stopping the interference of the outside interference. And the government has espoused a new conciliation policy and has got many policies in dealing with these issues to discuss things like the compensation and also those displaced people, discuss also these missing people and those who are on in retention, in order to reach for the national conciliation. That will be the only solution for the Syrian crisis. This dialogue is important. Militants don't want dialogue. If you don't want, we say to them, if you don't want dialogue, what do you want? The Syrian crisis has now reached over a year and a half, and things are getting worse. And the clashes are there. The matter is not the regime. That the responsible forces either in the government or those in opposition, say there is an operation to open political, overall political, to get the country out of this current crisis. As you know, the Syrian and Soviet relationship, and then the Russian and Syrian relationship. We came here to discuss many issues, and we talked about many issues again, about the oil sector, the transportation, all kind of transportation, the health, the higher education, our all industries, and I can say without any exaggeration, the Syrian-Russian discussion they've discussed all issues regarding that touches upon the Syrian people, and we thank the Russian.
Okay, so you're watching live pictures now of a press conference from Moscow where Syria's Deputy Prime Minister and a delegation is visiting the Russian capital. It's a fairly upbeat assessment from the Syrian Deputy Prime Minister. He said the Syrian crisis would be solved. He said there were many issues, urgent economic issues. Many of those were created by the crisis and Western sanctions. He said Western Europe was leading the sanctions against the regime, but he said all Syrians were suffering. So the press conference still going on. We're joined again by Michael Stevens. Michael, let's just go back to the point we were making there about the events at the UN. As this press conference is going on, of course, there's this vote later on at the UN General Assembly. It's an extraordinary vote condemning the UN Security Council for not coming to some kind of consensus on the crisis over Syria. What difference, though, will a non-binding resolution make to events on the ground? It's pretty toothless, isn't it?
I'm afraid to say it is pretty toothless, and actually what we've seen in the last month is an increasing disconnect between what's happening in New York and what's happening on the ground in Syria. And unfortunately, any resolution which is passed at the present time does not affect the major players that are going, into Syria and affecting the conflict directly with sort of finances, weapons, and logistical training. So on the sort of pro-Assad side, you have the Iranians offering a lot of support there directly involved on the ground. And then, of course, on the sort of anti-Assad side, you have, the Qataris, the Saudis, and the Turks. Now, any discussion that goes on in the General Assembly, that doesn't affect those dynamics. The conflict is affected primarily by the sort of flow of money, weapons, and capital into the country, and the ability of Assad forces to be able to take and hold urban centres, and for the FSA to be able to resist them. So those dynamics haven't changed, and they've stayed fairly static for the last 2 months. And unprecedented as this UN General Assembly vote might be, it doesn't affect that sort of equation in any way.
All right, Michael Stevens, thank you for joining us. We'll talk to you a little bit later on throughout the day, of course, when that vote happens at the UN General Assembly. Now, thousands of spectators are making their way to London's Olympic Park as the track and field events get underway. It's put the city's public transport